Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and this is Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1919 to 1929. Next slide. Seeing Red. As a result of the Russian Revolution, a, quote, Red Scare, end quote, swept the U.S. in 1919 and 1920. The Russian Revolution, class, is one of the most disruptive and telling events of the 20th century. Communism and before that anarchism, these were terms that signified disorder and disruption and a direct attack on capitalism and the American way. And there were very legitimate fears that somehow revolution might spread around the world, including to the United States. And that was a very real fear in the late teens and early 1920s. Next slide. Hooded hoodlums of the KKK. A reborn Klan boasted 5 million members amid this xenophobic era. One of the most dramatic photographs of the 1920s showing a march of hundreds, if not thousands, of hooded Klansmen in marching down the mall of Washington, D.C. The Klan was among the most powerful organizations in the United States. Washington, D.C. being on the edge of the Old South. Just a very telling slide and showing how powerful the old ways and racism was in the United States. Next slide. Stemming the foreign flood. Fear of foreigners caused immigration restrictions which reduced immigration to a trickle compared to pre-World War I levels. Kind of harkens back to this era. This visual here showing all the immigrants, and it says Europe here, and only a few getting through. The 1920s was a period of immigration restriction, and again, this was linked to that fear of communism, fear of foreigners that swept the United States after World War I. Next slide. The Prohibition Experiment. The attempt to outlaw alcohol was impossible to enforce and created a host of new problems. The great experiment of prohibition of the 1920s and early 1930s failed miserably. Alcohol consumption probably did not decline. In fact, it may have increased. And it led to the birth of, in many ways, of organized crime. Next slide. Monkey business in Tennessee. The Scopes quote-unquote monkey trial was an example of society being influenced by new values and new ideas. John Scopes was a teacher who taught evolution in his Tennessee high school class. There was an attempt to bar him from teaching this. It went through the courts, and it showed that many Americans were not ready for the new ideas that were flooding the United States at the time. Next slide. The mass consumption economy. Consumer goods such as the radio ushered the American people into the modern world. The radio, as shown here, had as much of a cultural impact as any invention in American history. Americans became instantly aware of news happening all over the world, sports, entertainment, and this was part of the road of America towards the mass culture, mass consumption economy, which we take for granted today. Next slide. Putting America on rubber tires. By the end of the 1920s, more than 20 million Americans were crisscrossing the nation. Ford Motor Company took the lead in providing affordable automobiles for the American people, roads paved by this time in many cities were crisscrossing the country, and America was becoming, again, the mobile modern society that we appreciate today. The 1920s was really a transition period in American history. Next slide. Humans develop wings. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic helped to popularize the burgeoning airplane industry. Here's Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, flying over Paris. Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic captivated not just the American people, but people around the world in 1927, and showed that, again, technology, progress, connection between the old and new world, everything was changing in the 1920s. Next slide. The radio and film revolutions. Radio and the motion picture industry helped to create an unprecedented unity and American culture. Here's Charlie Chaplin. He was the king of the silent film industry of the 1920s. He characterized and epitomized America's role as becoming the world's leader in culture. Even though he wasn't an American, he was British. He became an American icon. Next slide. The dynamic decade. Changing lifestyles and cultural mores for women and minorities were on display with the flappers and jazz. Women, among other things, won the right to vote in the 1920s, and their role in society changed. Women began to wear makeup, cut their hair, wear clothing that showed skin. The jazz age emerged, this new style of music popularized by African Americans, played on the radio and records. The record industry emerged. Again, so many changes in the 1920s. Next slide. Literary liberation. The lingering impact of World War I awoke an explosion of powerful, mournful literature in the 1920s. Ernest Hemingway became one of the leading writers of the era. Lots of books written about the aftermath and the legacy of World War I. Lots of books were written that didn't have happy endings, which was somewhat unusual, and kind of characterized an age of art and literature. Next slide. Wall Street's big bull market. The stock market boomed throughout the 1920s with no end seemingly in sight. The 1920s saw American corporations mushroom. The stock market, as it says on the slide, boomed. Confidence was at an all-time high. There seemingly was no stopping the American economy. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 31. Talk to you later, class.